On Saturday, May 14th, an 18-year-old white man drove over 200 miles to a predominantly Black community in Buffalo, New York. When he arrived in the parking lot, he started shooting. Ultimately, before he was taken into custody, he had shot and killed 10 African Americans who were shopping in this local grocery store. He actually shot 13 people, although 10 died. The aftermath of this mass shooting, this racist attack, there's been a lot of discussion and focus on the 180-page manifesto left by the murderer, and particularly its emphasis on the Great Replacement theory, as well as those folks in the media and some political circles who are helping to promote this theory. Today, I'm talking to experts on what the Great Replacement theory is, where it comes from, and its relevance not only to this massacre, but to all of us who are living in the US, particularly those that live in African American communities. I'm also talking to a Buffalo journalist about the aftermath of this shooting and how the city is trying to heal. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
If you're watching the Special Report, chances are you don't watch Fox News often. But if you've ever watched Fox News, particularly if you've ever watched the Tucker Carlson show, one of the top rated shows on that network, and as we all know, Fox is one of the top rated cable news networks, probably the most watched news network in the country. But Tucker Carlson repeated the Great Replacement theory over 400 times before the May 14th mass shooting in Buffalo. The New York Times analyzed over 1,100 episodes of Tucker Carlson Tonight and found that he closely mirrored the racist theory and baseless allegations. He mirrored the racist theory and he made baseless allegations that the Democrats and the nation's elites, as he likes to call them, have been intentionally bringing in more obedient voters from third world countries, and that the Democrats and these elites were bringing these voters in to replace the US electorate, which in 2020 was 70% white. It's difficult to understand how that kind of racist rhetoric can be disseminated by a cable news station. But more importantly, we're asking today, how dangerous is that rhetoric, particularly to immigrant populations and to African American communities? My first guest has been writing about Black communities for decades. He is an urban affairs, and he's the urban affairs editor and columnist with the Buffalo News. He's been writing about the Buffalo massacre as well. Good morning and welcome, Rod.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on to talk about this very important topic.
Yeah, so Rod Watson, that's your full name. You've been writing about the Black community. You've been writing about this shooting. Just help us understand how the city is feeling right now in this moment.
I think, first of all, if you go down to the site of the shooting and you see the memorial with the 10 photos of those 10 Black victims, I think your first reaction is just still, even a week, more than a week after, it's just disbelief that there could be so much hatred in this country just based on the color of a person's skin. But then after that, you get angry. You get angry at the fact that the U.S. has failed to live up, to those flowery words it put on paper. All of us are supposed to be created equal, and yet we have a tragedy like this based simply on the color of a person's skin. But then after that, you get angry at the politicians and the media outlets like Fox that have stoked this anger. Because Gendron, I don't think you can blame Gendron alone. I mean, he pulled the trigger, but he had a lot of help in getting to where he was mentally. You talked about Tucker Carlson, the New York Times. I think they called it pretty much flat out said it's the most racist TV show in the history of cable television. That's saying a lot for a major newspaper to say that flat out like that. But to me, it's not just Tucker Carlson, as bad as he is. he's billed as an opinion host. He can say whatever he wants. But if you watch the Fox News, what they call bill is their straight news programs, night after night after night, they have reporters stationed down on the Mexican border, and they're still propagating the same idea of invaders coming in to kill you, rape you, take your jobs, night after night after night. And when that's billed as straight news, I think that can have even a more devastating impact than, an opinion person, because opinion person, you can say, well, that's just his opinion. I can take it or leave it. The straight news is supposed to be factual. And this drumbeat, night after night after night, of these invaders coming in to take over our country can't help but have a devastating impact in creating situations like we experienced here in Buffalo. At the same time, besides the invasion at the border, there's also this myth of an invasion at the voting booth. And that's why you see this effort to deliberately, state after state after state, to try to make it as hard as possible for people in certain communities, that is Black and Hispanic communities, to actually exercise the right to vote, making it harder and harder because there's this fear that, they're coming and invading our voting booths as well to take over the country. And so you have these restrictions that make it harder and harder. They limit the number of polling places in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. So you have to stand in line in the hot sun all day long. And then to add insult to injury, nobody can even offer you a bottle of water. You want to make it as hard as possible for us to exercise a constitutional right that's, based in the Constitution. Again, these flowery words on paper that we have yet to really live up to. And night after night after night on certain networks, you get this, and it has a devastating impact, as we saw, weekend before last here in Buffalo, with 10 people killed just based on the color of their skin.
Yeah, Roger, right. Sometimes when I'm traveling and I'm just channel surfing, researching, just trying to see what Fox is saying, and you're absolutely correct. It's not just those prime time opinion hosts. It's the daytime news broadcast. It's the evening news broadcast. And I watch the station sometimes for a couple of hours, and I leave thinking, my goodness, for the person that only watches this all day, every day, their opinion, their beliefs are being shaped by so many lies, so many just fabrications, so many mischaracterizations of what's really happening. And oftentimes, those stories that you talked about, those border stories, are happening when there's some other really major thing happening in the news. Maybe it's the the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you turn on every other news station and they're talking about that, the Russians and the Ukrainians. But Fox is laser focused on perpetuating, this great replacement theory and its many iterations. And that border piece is one way that they do that, to try to show these, outrageous stories of people coming across the borders to, as you said, to do harm to quote unquote good Americans. Good Americans like those that are watching Fox News. You've got to lock your doors. You've got to be worried because these people, these brown people, are
these other people, these other people, this sense of otherness that they're creating. And they're either going to do physical harm to you, or they're going to take your job and bring down your standard of living.
Yeah, and what's really so troubling, Rod, is the advertisers. So obviously the opinion hosts can have the opinions that they have, but they only have those because of their ratings. They only have those because of the dollars, as we know in the news business, that advertisers pay to be on that station. So advertisers are willing to, really turn a blind eye to the racist rhetoric, all in the name of, selling detergent or selling whatever it is they're selling. That's also pretty appalling. I have to call out advertisers too.
Yeah, and you raise a good point, because in the sense that the network is just trafficking in hypocrisy as well, because they try to disavow the impact of the words that their hosts and newscasters spew. Yet on the other hand, they're charging advertisers millions of dollars because they know that words have impact. You can't argue it both ways, though they do. And it reminds me of, a few years ago when I tried to watch Fox. I think if you watched them back then, you recall Bill O'Reilly and others night after night were going after the so-called gangster rappers, talking about how that was fueling hate and violence in African-American communities because of the words that they were putting out. And yet now Tucker Carlson and even the straight news reporters are putting out some of those same kinds of damaging words and yet they want to try to disavow the impact of the words that they're spewing now. And again, it's just that blatant hypocrisy and the devastating and fatal consequences it can have.
Oh,
And in
yeah.
terms of this great replacement there, who's getting replaced? I mean, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in every major profession in the United States, whites are still overrepresented based on their share of the population, and Blacks and Hispanics are underrepresented. So who exactly is getting replaced by who? I mean, we're talking about equity here, but that's not a word you'll ever hear on Fox.
Yeah, no, it's the fear of the browning of the country. And just as an aside, we're going to get back to Buffalo, but you've raised so many good points about rappers. We saw Donald Trump spend so much of his time courting rappers like Kanye and Ice Cube. So this whole notion that the far right or Fox has disdain for rappers. We know Donald Trump will embrace anyone that says a kind word about him. So
He'll,
that hypocrisy, as you
he will
said.
use
But
anyone he can.
I'm going to run
Yeah.
out of time with you, Rod, and I got to talk about the city because, how is the city trying to heal? We see these communities, the community coming together. You talked about the memorial that's set up. We know that some members in the community are helping people get to grocery stores outside of that community because that market where the shooting took place is now closed. What else is happening in the city that is really efforts towards trying to heal, even though, closure, I don't even want to use the word closure because I don't know how those families ever get closure, but I've seen the mayor a couple of times on television talking about, how resilient the city is and what efforts are taking place, trying to bring some peace and healing to the city.
Yeah, there have been a lot of efforts in that regard. And, the major sports teams here, major entertainers, they've all been down to the site. They've hung out at the site, meeting with people, handing out food, making donations. There have been, food giveaways and water giveaways, basic supply giveaways around in the neighborhood around the site of the former Tops Market. But really, to me, the question is, what's the long-term change going to be? I think it's really a devastating commentary that closing one supermarket in an entire neighborhood can have such a devastating impact on that community, on the people in that neighborhood. Whereas when you go out in other neighborhoods, you will see a Tops and a Wegmans, which is our other major supermarket chain. They'll be right across the street from each other in those neighborhoods. So people in other neighborhoods have so many other options, and yet the underdevelopment, and disinvestment in communities of color. And Buffalo is one of the nation's poorest cities, and the neighborhood, the district where the Tops Market is located is one of the poorest areas in a poor city. And so I think the real question is, what are we going to do to permanently address these issues now that they've been so exposed by this shooting? And that's what I'm really going to be keeping my eye on as we go forward. The efforts that are being made now are wonderful. A lot of people are stepping up, making donations, giving up not only of their money, but their time, comforting the survivors and their relatives, making sure that they have what they need, as you say, providing transportation to others, grocery stores. But the real question is, when something like this happens, how do you develop a community, a Black community here in Buffalo, so that these efforts aren't so critical, that people have other alternatives that they can stand on their own 2 feet? And that's what we really need to focus on going forward if we're really going to bring something positive out of this tragedy.
Rod, I think I heard an expert say that Buffalo is, one of the most segregated cities in the country. And that, the divide,
Yeah.
you just
Yes.
described the racial, not only the racial divide, the economic divide, there's a huge divide. You mentioned, being one of the poorest communities. So do you see this shooting, as horrific as it is, having any impact on changing just even the demographics where people live in a city like Buffalo? It's kind of hard to use the word segregated in 2020, but that's the reality that many cities like Buffalo, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, a city that still is so incredibly segregated, which is just appalling on so many levels.
Yeah, you're right. Buffalo, year after year, makes that list of top 10 most segregated cities. It moves up and down somewhere in that list, but it's always on that list, and it's always been like that. And there have been efforts to expose the segregation, but there's still those attitudes that have to be broken down. And one of the things I think about a lot when I think about this tragedy And it may seem a stretch, but if I have a couple of minutes to explain it, this whole idea of critical race theory, I think education is so important. The idea of accurate historical education. Because if you look at the statistics, the poverty statistics we talked about, the wealth gap in this country, anywhere from 8 to 10 to 1. Blacks' household median income is only 60% of what whites earn. The unemployment rate, it goes up and down, but no matter what it is, the black rate will be double the white rate. If you're a white person and you look at those statistics and you say, well, we had the civil rights movement, we had the Fair Housing Act, we had the Voting Rights Act, we had the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, the playing field is level. So if you look at these statistics, there must be something wrong with those people. Again, we get back to that sense of otherness. But you have to put all of that in context. And that's what education is supposed to do, is to put all of that in context. And you don't even have to go back to 400 years ago, even though that's where everything started. If you just go back to the post-World War II era and the post-New Deal era, that's when federal policies were put in place that allowed whites coming out of World War II to benefit disproportionately from the development of the suburbs, to benefit disproportionately from the GI Bill. Even though a lot of those things were neutral on paper, the way they were implemented at the state and local level, whites got a leg up then that blacks never got. And so when you look at what's happening today, the statistics that you see today are a direct result of the advantages that whites were able to accumulate at that time and pass down to their children and grandchildren. And so, when you talk about opening a business, well, the white grandson of those people back in that era, he has that stake to open that business, where a black doesn't have that stake to open that business now because of the way those policies were implemented back then. But we don't teach our kids that. If you're really conspiratorial, you can say it's by design. And that's why, there's so much opposition to teaching accurate history in the schools. If we taught that history, we might be able to change some attitudes today when we think about all these disparities and want to blame the victims when actually they are victims of the society and the way that the system was set up and implemented back during those eras.
Yes, you're so right. And I've been saying on social media and on this show, I hope we see parents flood those school board meetings. The way we saw them flooding those meetings, demanding that critical race theory be taken out of schools, that they flood those meetings demanding that the great replacement theory also be removed from classrooms, and we see the same efforts. Excuse me. And I'm not even sick. Shot. I'm sorry, Rod. I had some kind of weird coughing, so I had to go get some water. Yeah, I was saying, I hope we see parents flood those school board meetings talking about the great replacement theory and the way we saw them flooding talking about critical race theory, because talk about something that's so damaging to our kids. And this statistic that says 1 in 3 Americans believe some version of this great replacement theory is really, really dangerous and really scary when you think about what our kids are being taught. Before I let you go, Rod, I do want to, you said something about the long-term impact of this shooting. I saw your mayor, the mayor of Buffalo, talk about the need for gun control. We have seen so many mayors, governors stand before cameras after these mass shootings talking about the need for gun control. And from Sandy Hook to the Parkland school shooting in Florida to now this Tops Market shooting in Buffalo, do you have any expectation or hope that we, I shouldn't say hope, I think we all hope for, but any expectation that we get to any kind of sensible gun control laws in this country in our lifetimes, really?
Not given the current makeup of the Senate. I mean, given where we are now, you have what I consider 40 Democrats, 50 Republicans, and two others. You never know which way they're going to go. Given that makeup, I can't see the Senate doing anything, particularly if they won't even consider eliminating the filibuster. So I don't see any really hope for gun control. One of the things that I did write about recently is the fact that, the gun rights advocates are always saying the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Well, we had a good guy with a gun at the Tops Market, a retired police officer who was a security guard at the market. And he actually got off some shots and actually hit the gunman several times. And yet the gunman was wearing body armor, so that the good guy with the gun had no impact. One thing we could do, and it does because it doesn't have any impact on your ability to own a gun, we could make body armor illegal for anyone except, police officers, security guards, armored car drivers, people who actually need it in their jobs. If we made body armor illegal, someone like this 18-year-old would not feel so invincible in going into a store like that and wreaking havoc like that. That's something that doesn't have anything to do with gun rights. And so it's something that maybe, possibly, Republicans and Democrats, at least enough of them could get behind in order to break that 60 vote threshold in the Senate. We might get something done along those lines. And then there are other things like, just background checks. I mean, even gun owners, vast majority of gun owners support common sense things like background checks. But again, given the makeup of the Senate, I just don't see anything happening along those lines. But maybe we can do something on body armor. That's the only hope I can see right now if I want to try to find a ray of hope in this tragedy.
That's a great point, and I haven't heard anyone talk about that, but you're right. There was a good guy in that store with a gun, and that good guy lost his life as well. So thank you for bringing up that point. Just final question for you. Those of us who are outside of Buffalo that feel the pain and want to be helpful, what can we do to help the community?
Okay, if you go to the Buffalo News website, we have a list of organizations that are trying to help the community that anyone in the country can donate to. That's at buffalonews.com, and you'll find it there. And that would be a great way to help the community and show support for the community. And the other thing we can do is this: no matter where you live, put impact on your politicians and on the businesses that you support so that they stop supporting networks like Fox News that are spewing out this hatred. I mean, let's face it, we're in the United States, money talks. And as consumers, we have that power if we choose to exercise it. Like you said, that about 1/3 of the country believes in the great replacement theory, but that means 2/3 of us don't. Those 2/3 have to become active and vocal, both with their votes, with their voices, but also with their dollars, where they choose to spend their dollars, who they choose to support.
No, great point, Rod. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. Thank you for giving us that information about how we that live outside of Buffalo can be supportive to the community and obviously to those families. Our heart, our prayers continue to go out. But yes, beyond that, it's action. It's pressing our lawmakers to make those laws that are going to protect communities and definitely those businesses that continue to support those that are complicit in some way in spreading these racist theories that are catching hold to young men like the man that is involved in this shooting. So again, thank you for your reporting. We'll continue to follow this story. All right, my next guest is Dr. Casey Kelly. He's a professor at the University of Nebraska. He's the author of Apocalypse Man, The Death, Drive, and Rhetoric of White Masculine Victimhood. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Kelly.
Good
So,
morning.
I know your research focuses a lot on this contemporary rhetoric, white masculinity and white supremacy. What are you to make of Tucker Carlson, these reports by the New York Times? Rod just said that the New York Times came out and explicitly said it's one of the most racist shows on television. This 400 times of him using great replacement theory even before the shooting. Is he the epitome of this white masculinity victimhood that you write about?
He's certainly a really prominent example of what I talk about in the book, which is the kind of apocalyptic tone that white men have taken, particularly over the past decade. But it's several decades in the making of trying to portray white men as a minoritized population that's undergoing a systemic effort to displace their power, entitlements, and privileges. And if you watch Tucker Carlson, the thing that you get is a steady diet of enmity. There's the amorphous they who are coming to take something from you. And so he repeats over and over again, they don't want you to have this. They don't want you to know this. They don't want you to hear this. And that is, a steady diet of that, can create a sense of otherness, a fearfulness, but also a sort of impending belief that there is an imminent conflict, even a race war of some kind that is on its way. And so he's more of the popular face of it. What we get from Tucker Carlson is the more kind of plausible deniability that comes with aspects of great replacement theory. So what you'll see on his show is the argument that voters are being replaced, that we're encouraging immigrants to come to the United States in order to have more pliable, compliant, obedient voters. What is left out is the kind of material that you hear on places like 4chan and 8chan, the kind of places that the alleged Buffalo shooter frequented right prior to the act of violence. And there you hear about that you hear the more explicitly anti-Semitic elements of it, that there's an international cabal of international Jews that are organizing, that control most of the world and its finances, a fairly unoriginal argument that has been drawn from racist conspiracy theories for centuries. And the other part you hear is the sort of scientific racism, which is that there are high fertility immigrants who are outpacing in terms of population, white populations. The declines in white birth rates means that the more immigrants come to the United States, the more likely they are to just simply outpace, and that a demographic crisis is impending. And that's the material that you get in spaces that are not, not for mainstream public consumption, but many people inhabit both of those spaces. And so in some ways, Tucker Carlson doesn't have to say the explicitly vile racist part. He can kind of leave that inferences for his viewers, especially if they are embedded in the kind of white supremacist networks that are outside of Fox News, that, places like Parler and 4chan, 8chan, and other kinds of image boards where there's more explicit, overt calls for racial violence. But they're not unconnected to each other either.
So, Dr. Kelly, some in the media have suggested that the great replacement theory has been a fringe theory that's now moved or is moving into the mainstream. But we know that's not accurate. Great replacement theory has been there. Even go back to a book like The Great Gatsby. Tom Buchanan is even talking about whites being replaced. We have presidents, Roosevelt and Coolidge, talking about ethnic mixing and the replacement of whites. So why are we talking about the great replacement theory? One, as if it's something that has been fringed and is now popular. And two, has there ever been a time in our history where you would say that 1 1/3, which is that now new statistics, believed in it? Is that new? I'm just trying to figure out, is there anything new about this?
Yeah, as you point out, the beliefs that we see expressed in the contemporary conspiracy theory are not just drawn from the far fringes of white supremacist neo-Nazi movements. They certainly have their place there, but they also have their place in the pantheon of mainstream political rhetoric. As you point out, President Teddy Roosevelt wrote extensively about the need for white women to produce more children because he believed at the end of the 19th century that there was a demographic crisis, that there would be a shift to a non-white majority. And so that demographic panic is repeating itself again, but it's certainly not an anomaly in American history. It's always sort of existed in some form or another. And for that matter, all of the discourse in the slavery and post-slavery Jim Crow eras about miscegenation and amalgamation is also, that's an embedded American discourse, fear of interracial dating, interracial marriage, interracial children. There's an extensive amount of panic about that throughout American history. Anti-miscegenation laws are not actually, that didn't get repealed that long ago. And so in light of that, there's the fears of both being overwhelmed by a horde of non-white others, and also just general fear that as the white racial stock becomes somehow diluted, that it will then dilute the political and economic power that comes with it. And so that's not an anomaly in American history, as you say. That's been in the mainstream. I think people are just attending to it now, I think because they're forced to. And I think that one of the largest problems is that to admit what we've just talked about is to upend some of the mythologies we have about the progress of American racial equality in America, and that we are still deeply embedded in white supremacy and white nationalism are still very much a part of American democratic history. And so I think that to talk about it in that way is one has to examine all of the myths that they hold to be true, which is that there's a fringe group of racists that are not on the right side of history. But the harder thing to do is to look inside and see the ways in which you've benefited from that and the way in which that's been a part of your history. That's a much harder thing to do. And so I think that it's easier to blame, fringe white supremacists than it is to take a hard look inside.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head because you're so right. So many of the folks that we hold up as heroes in this country, like Roosevelt, people don't want to go there. They don't want to examine them and see them for all of who they are or were and all of their complexities. We want to carve out the good part of them and, celebrate that and ignore, whether it's Woodrow Wilson, the Princeton and all of those, we can just, call the roll on white men, mostly who've been held up as heroes that would require us to take a second look at them, going back even to Thomas Jefferson. And we've had that conversation on this show, how we revere Thomas Jefferson. We overlook his slaves that he owned and, the other things that he did. Where does this leave us? And I want to bring into this conversation Marilyn Mayo. She is a senior research fellow at the Anti-Defamation League, a center on extremism. Welcome, Marilyn. So,
good morning.
Professor Kelly has just honestly said this is hard stuff for Americans to deal with because it exposes in so many ways how this racist rhetoric and ideology is so deeply embedded in everything America. And it prevents us from saying, it's those extremists over there. It's not us good, Democratic, in particular, Americans. So at the Anti-Defamation League, I know you all have been tracking these hate crimes, and I think I saw a statistic that African Americans continue to be the largest demographic that is targeted by these extremists. Is that accurate?
I believe that it's both African Americans and Jews who are targeted, by these extremists. And I think that, Professor Kelly was making a lot of very good points. And one of the things that we're seeing is really the radicalization of, there's, and I want to also point to, there are different versions of the Great Replacement theory, which have been alluded to. There's the extremist version, of course, that white supremacists and other extremists talk about, but there's also a more mainstream version, which we're also talking about, and both are harmful and toxic. The more mainstream version may not mention, Jews being behind the Great Replacement theory, but in any case, it's still talking about bringing in, the other, people of color to replace what people call either traditional Americans or legacy Americans, a lot of different buzz terms that are used. But to get back to the point I started to talk about the radicalization of young white men, what is tremendously concerning are the people who feel compelled, these young men who feel compelled to take action and take violent action. And this is something in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen a tremendous amount of violent mass murders, and this is obviously very concerning. And I think the other very important point to make is that every single one of those violent acts carried out by white supremacists inspires the next person to carry out the act. And we know this to be true because they actually say that themselves, these murderers. They talk about who has inspired them. And this was certainly the case in Buffalo, where this shooter on his rifle, which he was used obviously in such a brutal way to kill people, and he wrote many different things on that rifle to really emphasize what he was doing and why he was doing it. And included on that rifle, for example, was Dylan Roof, the young white supremacist who killed a number of people at the church in South Carolina in 2015. So at a Black church, I should obviously say. And while people were praying, I mean, and one, again, it's one act inspires the other, because another person who influenced this shooter in Buffalo was Brenton Tarrant. He was, a lot of the what he's calling his manifesto that was posted online actually copied word for word Brenton Tarrant's manifesto. And Brenton Tarrant killed 51 Muslims in New Zealand at mosques. So, I think it's important to see that these are not isolated incidents at all.
Right. And I want to ask you, Dr. Kelly, so that statistic that 1 in 3 Americans believe in some version of the Great Replacement Theory, Rod pointed out very appropriately that it means maybe 2/3 don't. But what about that 1/3? Who are they? Do you know who they are? And what version of this Great Replacement Theory are they buying into?
That's a good question. I would say that a portion of them are the kind of alienated young men that spend a significant amount of time in the sort of online network of white supremacy, and there's plenty of networks and nodes in the network that people can spend time in, and they can get a sense of kind of affirmation and community, and sometimes even entertainment in those particular communities. But I think that when you're speaking about the larger belief that maybe is held by people that aren't spending a lot of time on image boards, but are spending time watching, Tucker Carlson, I think that in some ways they're probably not totally familiar with all of the racist origins of the myth. I think that what their probably set of beliefs is probably organized around the idea that this is a political strategy that is designed to basically access a different kind of voting base and to then have that base drown out the interests of another base. But I don't think that they're necessarily aware of all of the other kinds of racist population science and other kinds of anti-Semitism that are sort of bound up in the more extreme version of the narrative. I think that most people, this probably begins with the rhetoric of anti-immigration, the rise of consistent rise of nativism in the United States, and the role that it plays in terms of fomenting enmity. That there's an amorphous enemy that is different, foreign, other, and they have come to take the thing that you have the right to possess, that it's your birthright entitlement, and that's something that someone wants to take for you. So I would say that there's various levels of commitment that you might see in that 1/3, right? Some people may just take it as an assumed, sort of cynical and racist idea that there's a different demographic voting bloc that's going to be used to usurp the interest of another. But I don't think they're necessarily aware of all the other kinds of racist entailments that come with it, which in some ways I'm hoping is something that is a little glimmer of hope, right? That when we point out the sort of deeply problematic violent racism that underwrites the myth, that it may make it more distasteful for some people to overtly identify with it.
Yeah, obviously you can think of the folks that stormed the Capitol as being a part of that 1/3, but when you talk about it being sanitized to be about voting and make it about Democrats versus Republicans, which is what Tucker Carlson is saying, is the Democrats and the national elite, that, Marilyn, makes it really easy, I think, for lots of people who consider themselves mainstream Republicans to say, yeah, this is a problem because the Democrats are stacking the deck. They're cheating the system somehow. They're bringing in these people who have no quote unquote rights to be here so that they can win elections. How do you combat that? Because that's not, attached to the man who drives 200 miles to shoot innocent people, or the Dylan Roof who goes into a church to shoot innocent people who are praying in a church. There's a lot of, space in between those two theories, but both equally problematic and dangerous. So how at the league are you fighting against, not just the extreme, which is, a lot easier, but the now more sanitized, more subtle version of this theory?
Well, unfortunately, we're seeing, certainly in the last few years, a real normalization of some hateful ideas. And one of the main things that I know we try to do is deal with social media companies, which, we've talked about the places where people go who find this kind of rhetoric, but you have to really go to the source, and social media companies have a responsibility to take hateful speech offline, but we also have to educate young people. And I think that this is something that we try to do with different programs that the ADL does, a World of Difference, and other programs that talk about accepting various differences and trying to understand, trying to get young people. And I think that the key is young people to understand that differences can be a good thing, right? And that we're a country of all different people and diversity. And I think, though, that there's also the adults that need to be aware of the impact that their words have. And I think it's really important that leaders, politicians and other leaders in communities speak out, when racist theories are promoted, when we see that people are being targeted for what their color, their religion, their gender, whatever it is. People, good people need to speak out, as the saying goes, and that's how we fight hate speech. We know that we can fight hate speech by promoting good speech. That's something we talk about. There's this idea that with the First Amendment, you can obviously the First Amendment is very important, but hate speech needs to be combated on a lot of different levels.
So, Dr. Kelly, last question for you. You've written the book, the definitive narrative on this population of white men who feel like they are victims or have made themselves into victims. What's the future of them? Are they going to, as long as there are political figures like Donald Trump and his minions, are they going to continue to grow and expand and prosper? Or do you see some immediate future where they are silenced?
That's a great question. I wish that I could be a little more optimistic. What I see in the sort of normalization of white supremacy, right, where far right ideas are becoming more acceptable to sort of speak in mainstream circles, where members of Congress can hold these beliefs and not be held accountable for any of them. And so I worry that we are in an age of demagoguery, of racist populism, in which the only way in which we can address large structural problems that seem alienating and difficult to deal with is to produce racial scapegoats. And so, right, part of the concern that I have is that the intensification of wealth stratification will likely produce the conditions for greater alienation and greater radicalization of young white men in particular. And this is a problem that is deeply structural, but one that demagogues don't tend to offer the actual solution for, right? So Trump didn't really offer any kind of, substantive economic strategy that would, lift, middle America Rust Belt voters out of their, long, decline. Instead, he suggested that the reason that they are imperiled is because, Democrats, diversity, political correctness, immigrants, foreigners, all of those are the forces that explain why your life didn't turn out the way that you thought it would. And the reason that you turn to someone like Trump is that he offers, a salve, an easy solution to fix a problem that is not immediately fixable. And so my concern is that, right, you see the young men that turn to, these sort of dark spaces on the internet also don't see a sense of future. They don't see the possibility of, if you combine climate change and the intensification of wealth stratification, it produces the ideal conditions for young white men to turn to white supremacy, nativism, and other kinds of, violent white supremacist beliefs. And then you have a political culture that has produced enmity and otherness as, the fundamental problems that aren't really what are causing, wealth stratification. And so until we, I think, address the underlying root causes of that alienation, then I think we're going to see, sadly, more of these attacks. And so I'm not sure what the future would hold. I think that until we address problems that are so widespread structural, things like automation, deindustrialization, intense wealth stratification, those kind of things are going to produce the conditions that will radicalize young men.
All those things that we definitely don't want to talk about or deal with in this country. So I hate to end segments on such a negative note, but I like reality. We love reality here, and you just gave it to us real. So thank you for that, Professor Kelly. Again, you're the author of Apocalypse Man, The Death, Drive, and Rhetoric of White Masculine Victimhood. All right. Thanks, Dr. Kelly. Thanks, Marilyn. We're going to keep talking about this. My next guest knows a whole lot about this victim blaming as it relates to immigrants in particular. His name is Alan Orr. He's the founder of the Washington, D.C. based Orr immigration law firm. He's the first Black president of the American Immigration Law Association. Good morning, Alan, and welcome. Dr. Kelly painted a pretty sober picture there, and you are an immigration lawyer. So first question I have for you is, how does this rhetoric and this rise in this rhetoric, how is it impacting immigration policy in this country?
I think it isn't impacting. I think it sort of drives the policy, because I think it's what drove the Trump administration and drove Trump to the White House was this threat of othering. And it also drove the United States to do things that it traditionally would not do, such as separate families, right? We generally would not be behind such a harsh term, but we did it, and nobody was in the streets marching about it. Recently, under Title 42, which was started by Stephen Miller, which is something that hasn't been used since 1944, that keeps Black and brown immigrants from coming to the country, and all other immigrants are able to fly in. No outpouring about it. The courts stand behind it. At the very same time, we say we're unable to process immigrants at the southern border, but 20,000 Ukrainians show up and we're able to process them at the southern border. So that kind of consistent treatment reinforces the analysis that we're under invasion and someone's coming to take something from you, which is the hardest part of replacement theory. The soft part of replacement theory is just that it happens naturally, right? It always happens naturally because people are going to continue to grow at whatever rate they do grow. But the replacement theory that we talked about, the very dangerous one, is that there's some person behind it instrumenting these people to come in, and that in some way, someone who is a migrant to this country, who gets in the asylum system, probably takes them 10 years to get a green card, and then 5 years after that to be able to vote, is going to naturally vote Democratic and have such power to do that.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that Title 42. The Biden administration just recently tried to lift that policy, and the court said no. The court says no, and the policy, I guess, was implemented, you said, under the Trump administration, under the guise of protecting Americans from the spread of COVID, from this public health crisis. What was the reasoning that the court used in denying the Biden administration from lifting that ban?
So I think it was flawed reasoning, and it was an administrative. There's always two parts of always cases: administrative posture, did you do the right thing the right way? And then the substance of the law. They didn't even get to the substance. They just said the Biden administration didn't follow the administration appeals procedure, the APA, which requires them to give notice that they were ending it, which isn't really true, because Title 42 was renewable in a 90-day period. So anytime it was renewed, all those states knew in 90 days that it was going to end. In addition to that, the court said that the Biden administration must go through the whole notice procedure, 60 days, comments, public rules, all that. But it never said that that was required to actually implement 42. So that's sort of just it's a weird analysis from the court of using the discretion of the executive branch. And this is something that we've seen from the last administration, where we've actually seen the different branches of government stop operating effectively that we would like to see in a democracy. So no longer is the executive branch able to sort of carry out the laws. Congress has been woefully not acting at all on immigration law for the last 20 years. They haven't passed an immigration bill. But now you see the court step in an arena in which Congress should be taking the place in deciding what immigration law is. And the problem with that is the courts aren't elected in that same sense in which the executive branch was. So we're actually stifling Biden's policy overall with regards to immigrants by the court.
And what about governors like those in Texas who threaten every day? Again, if you're watching Fox News, you hear the governor of Texas threatening to, take it into his own hands, to take over immigration policy at the Texas border, to put immigrants on buses, to ship them to DC. Is all that just bluster from the Texas governor, or is there really an effort on the part of that governor to intervene, to usurp the authority of the federal government with respect to immigration policies in Texas?
So it's a little bit of theater. So a couple of things about Texas specifically. One, the power grid doesn't work, and he spent a ton of money on the border instead of fixing the power grid. Secondly, he's using immigrants, living people as things by busing them to DC. And then in DC, we're doing exactly what we expect a humanian person to do with women and children, is we're helping them get to the destinations they need to be in to receive the healthcare they need. So that's really a blunt estimate.
So he is actually putting people who cross the border into Texas onto buses and
Yes.
sending them to DC?
Yes, there have been over 20 buses that have been arrived in DC and been dispersed throughout the region, in which we've sort of helped them here get to the next stage.
Authority, since the immigration is under the purview of the federal government, how can he even do that?
He's voluntarily misleading these people and putting them on buses. So yes, he does have that authority. He also started his own sort of border control, which is now in court, the Lone Star Enforcement. So he has stepped way beyond the purview of what immigration needs to be. And this is where Congress really should step in and sort of settle this issue, because we can't have 50 different immigration policies for all these different states. But at the very same time, what is important about Texas is that Texas crossed the border did not cross Texas. So what we now call Texas was in fact Mexico. In addition to that, all of these cities that are screaming about the number of immigrants that are coming in every day make their main profits from those border institutions. So it's kind of a weird analysis to say, send us all of your good trade, all of your good workers, but anything else, we don't want that, right? It's a very American system to say, just give us the good. We're not going to deal with the whole part of what's involved in being at the border. But in addition to that, every day, every minute, there's a truck or some other visa classification coming across that southern border. So it is not impossible for us to allow asylum seekers to come to this country. We're just keeping a certain class out. And that's specifically what Stephen Miller wanted to do with the 1944 rule, was sort of aim at Black and brown immigrants. So it's a very exact tool. And there are also Democrats who are falling prey to this that are saying, oh my God, the United States can't handle 18,000 people a day. That is ridiculous. We've seen Poland, a state, country the size of New Mexico, accept 2 million people when they wanted to, with a public-private partnership to help people who are in need. So what we're not seeing now is this humanitarian sort of aid at the border, but we're sort of saying is they're things, they're chattel, But at the very same time, economically, we need more workers. For the last 3 quarters, our government has said, we're going to increase the number of H-2B workers, which are temporary seasonal workers, because we have jobs that can't be filled, and we know that we need immigrants. But what we're saying is we don't need those immigrants. We don't need the Black ones. We don't need the brown ones. And it's all linked to this replacement theory. And the biggest fear about replacement theory is that when we achieve that greater populace and that control is that we're going to treat them the way that they treated us. That's the real fear.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you said that, because that is undergirding so much of this fear is that, wow, we know how horrible we've been. So God forbid people that we've been horrible to now have the power and then they reciprocate. But go back to your point about the need for workers and the granting of these temporary visas for workers. So who's getting those temporary visas? Are they people from coming in from the Mexican
Absolutely.
border?
The exact same. So it's people who have not been, so people who have been expelled under Title 42 are able to get these visa classifications if they're able sort of to find and be in the right classes. But yes, it's the same people from that same category of people from those same countries that get in. And so the issue that
on the low, we don't talk a lot about the fact that we're publicly talking about the need to repel them and to prevent them from coming into the country. But on the other hand, we're like sliding them that visa, like, come on, we really need you to work.
Well, unless you're at your summer retreat or you're going skiing or you own a hotel or you own any of these luxury places that you're not able to get workers for. A lot of farmers, right, are in this situation. That's why you had a large number of people who are undocumented working at chicken plants because Americans were no longer taking those jobs. So yes, it is really interesting to me that America overall is we don't want these immigrants, but companies are saying we need these immigrants, we need these jobs here. One of the problems that we saw in this country that sort of led to where we are today is that we stopped bringing those immigrants in and then all those jobs moved across the border, moved overseas to different places. And now we're trying to get those jobs back. And that's why we have problems with baby formula, right? We only have one company that makes it. We don't really make any textiles in this company anymore. We don't really do serious farming in this country anymore. So we're susceptible to all of these things that happen out across the border. And then we have issues of salmonella that breaks out from whatever plant that came from Mexico, or a shortage of this, or a shortage of chips, because we decided a long time ago that we're not going to make things here anymore because it's above us or beneath us or whatever the concern may be. But in that same realm, we know we need immigrants because that's what makes this country so great.
How are Democrats trying to justify, if they are, the 20,000, or did you say 20? Yeah, you said 20,000 Ukrainian immigrants that are allowed into the country. How are they justifying differentiating between those immigrants and these at the border who are being, treated in such a different and inhumane way?
I'm going to tell you a very interesting bedtime story. Because first we were dealing with the Afghans and we said they helped us in war. We should do something to help them, but we can't give them anything else. We can't give them TPS. We can't do this. Then Ukraine broke out. And then we did exactly for the Ukrainians what we said we couldn't do for the Afghan people that actually helped us during the battle, right? And at the same time, then we went full out and said, we're going to give them TPS, which is a temporary protective status, which allows them to be here and work and study for people who are here. But at the same time, we had Cameroonians who had many atrocities in their home country and have been asking for TPS for 2 years. And so the government said, we'll give it to the Cameroonians, but we're going to forget about Ethiopia. So the concern now is that they're trying to balance this out a little bit by picking one from each group at each time to say, okay, we'll pick someone who's brown or Black and try to help them to match sort of this thing that we're doing overall. But there is nothing that you can do to resolve yourself with the picture that you have Mexican, Haitians, and other people from around the world at the southern border. And you said you can't process them. But in a month, you process 20 Ukrainians who literally walk past these people on the way in the border and then get in the country and say, yeah, we just walk past them. There's no explanation for that. We know what it is. It's a preference. It's white, blonde people get preference over Black and brown people. And that enforcement is not carried out by our Department of Justice. I'm surprised that the Civil Rights Division hasn't made an issue of this because it is a preference given based on nationality or skin color. It should not be allowed.
Clark on this. You're thinking like, where's Merrick Garland on this? Where is the outrage by the Justice Department that these Black and brown immigrants are being treated, inferior compared to how these white or Nordic-looking Ukrainians. Wow, such an interesting topic. I'm out of time, Alan, but thank you so much for your expertise on this and your insights. I guess this is under the Democratic administration. So as much as we'd like to think that the Democrats do a better job, I guess you would say that's not the case, at least.
They're still white Democrats, right?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Then they send our poor vice president to the border and make her the heavy on this. Okay. Wow.
And blame her for something she has nothing to do. She has more responsibility as the vice president, any vice president in immigration ever in the history of the world. The New York Post today has a story saying she's done nothing on immigration. And I'm thinking to myself, she doesn't have the purview to do anything on immigration.
Well, I said they sent her to the border to be the heavy on policies that are being implemented by Congress that she doesn't control, because we know at the end of the day, the White House has very little power over immigration, even trying to, amend this Title 42, and the court said no to that. So it just shows how limited executive power is on these immigration issues. But again, thank you so much, Alan, for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
And fascinating topic. Wow, I want to thank all of my guests. This is really a topic that hits home. And the guest today, I think, made it very plain. This great replacement theory is not just some fringe theory that white supremacists who spend a lot of time on the dark web are thinking about or are acting on as the shooter that we saw in Buffalo. This theory has so many iterations and it's been sanitized in so many ways that your next door neighbor, your colleague probably has some belief in some version of this theory, and it's very, very, very dangerous. As we heard my first guest, Rod, say, when we're not teaching history in our schools, when we're not teaching accurate U.S. history, not Black history, not critical race theory, but accurate U.S. history, as Professor Kelly said, the reason is it's probably just too painful. It's way too painful for Americans to face up to the fact that many of the folks we've been told are our heroes are in fact some of the most racist people in this country. I didn't say it, Professor Kelly said it. All of my guests have been saying it. It's a hard pill to swallow, but until we swallow that pill, we're going to keep seeing the repeat of what we saw in Buffalo. And at some point, families and communities are tired of, the playbook, the prayers, the thoughts, the flowers. All that's nice. But as Rod said, it's time for real change. And we don't get to real change until we acknowledge the real problem. My words to live by, Dr. Martin Luther King famously said, history will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. So I want you to ask yourself, are you the bad people or are you the silent good people? Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.